The sun was just beginning to set over the quiet suburb, painting the streets in soft hues of orange and pink. Officer James Connolly was finishing up his routine patrol, eager to head home after a long day on the job. He prided himself on being a no-nonsense cop who followed the rules to the letter. But that evening, one decision would set off a chain of events he could never have anticipated. It all started with a call. A concerned shopkeeper had reported a suspicious young girl hanging around his store. "She's loitering, looking like she might cause trouble," the voice on the other end of the line had said. Without hesitation, Officer Connolly responded to the scene. He didn't ask too many questions. He believed his job was to act, not to overthink. When he arrived, he spotted the girl immediately. She was small, barely reaching his chest, with a backpack slung over her shoulder and fear written all over her face. She looked around nervously, clutching a small bag of snacks. Connolly's instincts kicked in, and before she could explain herself, he handcuffed her. To him, she was just another case, another report to file before the end of his shift. But this wasn't just any girl. Unbeknownst to him, the 12-year-old wasn't a runaway or a petty thief. She was the daughter of his boss, Chief Angela Williams, a no-nonsense leader who had worked tirelessly to bring fairness and accountability to the department. More importantly, the young girl hadn't committed any crime. She was simply waiting for her ride home after picking up snacks for a school project. Connolly didn't see her humanity. He didn't notice her trembling hands or the tears welling up in her eyes. All he saw was a problem to be dealt with. The shopkeeper's assumptions had shaped his view, and he let his biases guide his actions. Within minutes, the girl's sobs drew the attention of a small crowd. Passers-by stopped and started recording the scene on their phones. Some pleaded with Connolly to let her go, while others asked why he was arresting a child. But Connolly, stubborn and unyielding, dismissed them all. Then, in a twist of fate, Chief Williams herself pulled up to the scene. She had received a frantic call from her daughter moments earlier, but had no idea what awaited her. Stepping out of her car, still in uniform, she froze as she saw her child in handcuffs, surrounded by onlookers. Connolly turned to face his boss, his face pale as he realized who the girl was. "Chief Williams, I didn't know," he stammered, but the damage was done. What happened next would leave everyone stunned. Karma was about to deliver a lesson that no one at that scene would forget anytime soon. Would you like me to continue the script, refine this further, or develop any specific angle of the story? Chief Williams stared at her daughter in disbelief. Her uniform, a symbol of authority and protection, suddenly felt like a burden. She'd spent years commanding respect in a profession that wasn't always kind to her as a black woman, but this, seeing her 12-year-old child in cuffs, vulnerable and scared, was something she never imagined. "Officer Connolly," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "What's going on here?" Connolly straightened up, his nerves evident as he scrambled for an explanation. "Ma'am, I received a call about suspicious behavior. The store owner said." Chief Williams cut him off with a raised hand. "You arrested a child based on a phone call without any evidence, without asking any questions." Her eyes burned with anger, but there was something deeper there too, a quiet devastation. The crowd grew quieter, sensing the weight of the moment. The girl, still in cuffs, looked at her mother with a mix of relief and confusion. "Mom," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks, "I didn't do anything." Chief Williams stepped closer to her daughter, her protective instincts overriding her professional demeanor. She crouched down to meet her daughter's eyes. "I know, sweetheart, I know." Then she turned to Connolly, her tone icy. "Take those cuffs off, now." Connolly hesitated, his face pale. He fumbled for the keys and unlocked the cuffs, his hands shaking as he removed them from the young girl's wrists. She rubbed her wrists, the red marks a painful reminder of what had just happened. "I'm sorry," Connolly muttered, but his apology felt hollow. The crowd murmured, their phones still pointed at him. Every moment of this encounter was being recorded, shared, and dissected. Chief Williams took her daughter by the hand and walked her to the car. As she opened the door for her to get in, she whispered, "Sit tight, okay? I'll handle this." The girl nodded, her tearful eyes now filled with trust in her mother. Returning to Connolly, Chief Williams didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her authority was clear in the way she stood, her eyes locking onto his. "You've made a serious mistake," she said quietly but firmly. "You didn't follow protocol. You didn't assess the situation. You didn't see her for what she is, a scared child." Connolly stammered again. "Ma'am, I was just—" "Saving it for your report," she interrupted. "You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself." The store owner, who had initially called the police, poked his head out of the shop. "Officer, I thought you'd just talk to her, maybe scare her off. I didn't mean for all this to happen." Chief Williams turned her attention to him. "So you assumed she was trouble because— Why? She didn't do anything wrong, and you had no reason to call the police on a child who was simply standing outside your store. Is this how you treat all your customers?" The man stuttered. I just thought." "You thought wrong," she said, cutting him off. "You should think very carefully before you make a call like that in the future." The crowd began to disperse, but the whispers didn't stop. People exchanged knowing looks, some muttering about what they'd just witnessed. The videos were already circulating online, and while Chief Williams didn't know it yet, the incident was about to become much bigger than anyone anticipated. As the chief drove her daughter home, the girl finally spoke up. "Mom, why did he do that? Why did he think I was bad?" Chief Williams sighed, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Because some people don't take the time to see the whole picture, sweetheart. They judge too quickly. And sometimes they let fear or bias guide them instead of their better judgment." "But you're the boss," the girl said, her voice small but filled with curiosity. "Can't you fix it?" Her mother paused, her heart heavy. "I'm going to try, baby, I promise." Back at the station, Connolly sat at his desk, his mind racing. He knew he'd messed up, but he hadn't fully grasped the consequences yet. The videos from the scene were going viral, and the department's phones were already ringing with calls from reporters and concerned citizens. The weight of his actions was settling on him like a heavy fog. He replayed the incident in his mind, trying to convince himself he'd just been doing his job. But the image of the young girl's face, her tears, and the look of betrayal in Chief Williams' eyes wouldn't leave him. Later that night, Chief Williams sat at her kitchen table, her daughter asleep in the next room. She stared at her phone, watching one of the videos from the scene. The comments poured in, some supportive, others questioning how this could happen in her department. She felt a mix of anger, shame, and determination. She knew this was about more than just her daughter. It was about trust, accountability, and a responsibility she carried as the leader of the force. She had fought hard to change the culture within the department, to make it one where mistakes like this wouldn't happen. But now, the cracks were undeniable. The next day, the station was buzzing with activity. Reporters camped outside, demanding answers. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what this incident would mean for the department. Connolly avoided everyone, keeping his head down and praying for the storm to pass. But karma doesn't wait. It was coming for him, and it wasn't going to be subtle. Chief Williams called an emergency meeting, her voice over the intercom commanding all officers to assemble in the briefing room. Connolly's stomach churned as he took a seat, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. When Chief Williams entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. She stood tall, her presence commanding attention. "We have a problem," she began, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Yesterday, one of our officers made a decision that reflects poorly on this department. That decision was based on assumptions, not evidence, and it ended with my 12-year-old daughter in handcuffs." The room was silent. Every officer's eyes were on her, except Connolly's. He stared at the floor, wishing he could disappear. "This isn't just about my child," she continued. "This is about every person in this community who trusts us to protect them, not to harm them. When we let bias cloud our judgment, we fail them, and that is unacceptable. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She wasn't yelling, but the weight of her disappointment was palpable. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, the reality of the situation sinking in. Chief Williams turned to Connolly, her gaze unwavering. "Officer Connolly, you have some explaining to do. Not just to me, but to this department and this community. And believe me, there will be accountability." Connolly nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The repercussions of his actions were about to ripple far beyond the walls of the station. And for the first time, he realized that karma wasn't just coming for him, it was already here. Let me know if you'd like the next part of the story, or if there's anything specific you'd like to add or adjust. The station was quieter than usual after the meeting, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Officer Connolly sat at his desk, trying to compose the report Chief Williams demanded by the end of the day. His hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of where to start. Every sentence he typed felt like an excuse. Every justification rang hollow. His colleagues avoided him, though their glances said enough. He had become the cautionary tale no one wanted to discuss. Meanwhile, Chief Williams was in her office, the door closed, but the weight of the situation pressing in from every side. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from reporters, community leaders, and even friends who had seen the viral footage. Each notification reminded her of the delicate line she had to walk, balancing her personal anger as a mother with a professional duty as the head of the department. The next call was from the mayor. "Angela, we've got a problem," the mayor said, skipping the pleasantries. "This story has the whole city talking, and not in a good way. We need a plan, fast." "I'm working on it," Chief Williams replied. "But I'm not going to sweep this under the rug or throw out a PR statement to make it go away. We owe the community transparency and accountability." "I respect that," the mayor said, though there was hesitation in her voice. "But the longer we wait, the worse it looks. I need you to address this publicly, soon." After hanging up, Chief Williams stared at her desk. On it were reports from past cases she'd fought to handle with fairness, cases where she had challenged the old guard to change their ways. She'd made progress, she was sure of that. But this incident felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. At the same time, the videos of the arrest were gaining traction online. Social media was flooded with commentary. Some users criticized the officer's actions, while others questioned why such biases persisted in policing. Some defended Connolly, calling it a misunderstanding, while others pointed out the broader systemic issues at play. Among those watching was a local journalist named Maya Rodriguez. She had covered stories about policing in the city before, and something about this one felt different. It wasn't just the dramatic video or the fact that the child was the chief's daughter. It was the layers of complexity, the way it touched on trust, accountability, and the intersection of power and vulnerability. Maya decided to dig deeper, reaching out to community members and officers willing to speak anonymously. That evening, Chief Williams sat down with her daughter at the dinner table. The girl was quiet, pushing her food around on her plate. "How are you feeling?" Chief Williams asked gently. "Okay, I guess," her daughter replied, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Mom, are people going to hate me because of this?" Chief Williams's heart sank. "No, sweetheart, this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. People are upset because they care, because they want things to change, and that's not a bad thing." "But what about him?" the girl asked, referring to Connolly. "Do you think he's sorry?" Chief Williams paused. She wanted to say yes, but she wasn't sure. "I hope he is," she said finally. "But being sorry isn't enough. People have to learn from their mistakes and make things right. That's what I'm working on." At the station, Connolly was having his own moment of reflection. He had replayed the encounter over and over in his mind. Each time, he saw something new: the fear in the girl's eyes, the way the crowd looked at him, the quiet disappointment in Chief Williams's voice. He knew he'd acted rashly, but what haunted him most was the realization that his actions weren't just a mistake. They were a reflection of deeper biases he hadn't confronted. The next morning, Chief Williams called for a meeting with her leadership team. "We need to address this head-on," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture we've created and the gaps we've allowed to grow. I want mandatory bias training for every officer, starting immediately. And I want a community forum where we can hear directly from the people we serve." Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Change wasn't always welcomed, even when it was necessary. Later that day, Maya Rodriguez published her first piece about the incident. It wasn't sensational or accusatory, it was thoughtful, focusing on the broader implications of what had happened. She highlighted the challenges Chief Williams faced as both a leader and a mother, and she questioned what steps the department would take to rebuild trust. The article quickly gained attention, sparking even more conversations in the community. As the story unfolded, the shopkeeper who had made the call to the police found himself in the spotlight as well. People began boycotting his store, accusing him of profiling the young girl. In an attempt to defend himself, he gave a public statement. "I didn't mean any harm," he said. "I was just trying to protect my business. I thought she might. Well, I just wasn't sure." His words only fueled the fire. "You weren't sure, so you assumed the worst?" one reporter asked. The question hung in the air, echoing the sentiment of many who had seen the video. As tensions grew, Chief Williams prepared for the community forum. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was necessary. She stood in front of the mirror, practicing her opening remarks, determined to strike the right balance between accountability and hope. Meanwhile, Connolly sat in his apartment, staring at the invitation to the forum on his phone. He wasn't required to attend, but something inside him told him he should. He didn't know if he had the courage to face the community, but he also knew he couldn't run from what he'd done. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved to face their own truths. But as the day of the forum approached, the unanswered questions loomed larger than ever. How could trust be rebuilt? Could Connolly redeem himself? And what would it take for the community to feel safe and respected again? Karma wasn't finished yet. The lessons were still unfolding, and the road ahead was anything but clear. Let me know if you'd like to continue the story or refine this section further. The community forum was scheduled for a Wednesday evening at the town hall, a space that was quickly becoming symbolic of tension and transformation. By the time Chief Williams arrived, the room was already filling up. Rows of chairs stretched across the floor, most of them occupied by residents with furrowed brows and folded arms. Cameras from local news stations were stationed at the back, their red lights glowing, ready to broadcast every moment. Chief Williams took a deep breath before stepping inside, her uniform pressed, her expression composed. This wasn't just about the department anymore. It was about her, her daughter, and the promise she had made to the community when she accepted the badge. At the back of the room, Officer Connolly lingered by the door, uncertain whether he belonged there. He had decided to come, though every instinct told him to stay away. He wore plain clothes to avoid drawing attention, but his presence didn't go unnoticed. A few people gave him pointed looks, and whispers followed him as he found a seat in the corner. That evening, Chief Williams sat down with her daughter at the dinner table. The girl was quiet, pushing her food around on her plate. "How are you feeling?" Chief Williams asked gently. "Okay, I guess," her daughter replied, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Mom, are people going to hate me because of this?" Chief Williams's heart sank. "No, sweetheart, this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. People are upset because they care, because they want things to change, and that's not a bad thing." "But what about him?" the girl asked, referring to Connolly. "Do you think he's sorry?" Chief Williams paused. She wanted to say yes, but she wasn't sure. "I hope he is," she said finally. "But being sorry isn't enough. People have to learn from their mistakes and make things right. That's what I'm working on." At the station, Connolly was having his own moment of reflection. He had replayed the encounter over and over in his mind. Each time, he saw something new: the fear in the girl's eyes, the way the crowd looked at him, the quiet disappointment in Chief Williams's voice. He knew he'd acted rashly, but what haunted him most was the realization that his actions weren't just a mistake. They were a reflection of deeper biases he hadn't confronted. The next morning, Chief Williams called for a meeting with her leadership team. "We need to address this head-on," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture we've created and the gaps we've allowed to grow. I want mandatory bias training for every officer, starting immediately. And I want a community forum where we can hear directly from the people we serve." Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Change wasn't always welcomed, even when it was necessary. Later that day, Maya Rodriguez published her first piece about the incident. It wasn't sensational or accusatory, it was thoughtful, focusing on the broader implications of what had happened. She highlighted the challenges Chief Williams faced as both a leader and a mother, and she questioned what steps the department would take to rebuild trust. The article quickly gained attention, sparking even more conversations in the community. As the story unfolded, the shopkeeper who had made the call to the police found himself in the spotlight as well. People began boycotting his store, accusing him of profiling the young girl. In an attempt to defend himself, he gave a public statement. "I didn't mean any harm," he said. "I was just trying to protect my business. I thought she might. Well, I just wasn't sure." His words only fueled the fire. "You weren't sure, so you assumed the worst?" one reporter asked. The question hung in the air, echoing the sentiment of many who had seen the video. As tensions grew, Chief Williams prepared for the community forum. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was necessary. She stood in front of the mirror, practicing her opening remarks, determined to strike the right balance between accountability and hope. Meanwhile, Connolly sat in his apartment, staring at the invitation to the forum on his phone. He wasn't required to attend, but something inside him told him he should. He didn't know if he had the courage to face the community, but he also knew he couldn't run from what he'd done. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved to face their own truths. But as the day of the forum approached, the unanswered questions loomed larger than ever. How could trust be rebuilt? Could Connolly redeem himself? And what would it take for the community to feel safe and respected again? Karma wasn't finished yet. The lessons were still unfolding, and the road ahead was anything but clear. Let me know if you'd like to continue the story or refine this section further. The community forum was scheduled for a Wednesday evening at the town hall, a space that was quickly becoming symbolic of tension and transformation. By the time Chief Williams arrived, the room was already filling up. Rows of chairs stretched across the floor, most of them occupied by residents with furrowed brows and folded arms. Cameras from local news stations were stationed at the back, their red lights glowing, ready to broadcast every moment. Chief Williams took a deep breath before stepping inside, her uniform pressed, her expression composed. This wasn't just about the department anymore. It was about her, her daughter, and the promise she had made to the community when she accepted the badge. At the back of the room, Officer Connolly lingered by the door, uncertain whether he belonged there. He had decided to come, though every instinct told him to stay away. He wore plain clothes to avoid drawing attention, but his presence didn't go unnoticed. A few people gave him pointed looks, and whispers followed him as he found a seat in the corner. Let me know if you'd like to continue from here or refine this section further. The night after the community forum, Chief Williams struggled to sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in her mind. Her daughter's quiet resilience, the raw anger of the crowd, and Connolly's unexpected apology, all of it weighed heavily on her. She knew the night had shifted something, but whether it was for better or worse remained to be seen. The next morning, as the city began to settle into its usual rhythm, a new piece of information surfaced that threatened to upend everything. Maya Rodriguez, the journalist who had been digging deeper into the story, received a tip from an anonymous source within the department. The email was short but damning. There was more to the arrest than what had been shown in the viral video. Attached was a link to internal records, including bodycam footage and a report that had been quietly filed after the incident. Maya hesitated for a moment before opening the file. As she watched the footage, her heart sank. The video showed Connelly approaching the girl outside the convenience store, but there was a brief moment before the arrest that hadn't been publicized. The shopkeeper, who had called the police, could be heard saying, "You know how kids like her are, always up to something." The comment was loaded, its implication clear, and Connelly's response, or lack thereof, was equally troubling. Instead of questioning the statement or asking for clarification, he nodded slightly and moved toward the girl. It wasn't outright complicity, but it revealed a bias that had influenced his actions. Maya's hands trembled as she closed the file. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake anymore. It was about a culture that allowed such assumptions to persist unchecked. She knew the story needed to be told, but she also knew the backlash would be intense. Later that day, the article went live. Maya framed it carefully, highlighting the systemic issues without vilifying any single person. Still, the headline was enough to spark a firestorm. New evidence reveals hidden bias in high-profile arrest. Within hours, the article was trending, and the city was buzzing once again. Chief Williams read the piece in her office, her jaw tightening with every sentence. She had spent years fighting to change the culture within her department, but this revelation felt like a personal failure. She knew she needed to address it, but she also knew that doing so would further strain the fragile trust she had worked so hard to rebuild. At the same time, Connelly was sitting in his car outside the station, his phone buzzing with messages. Some were from colleagues offering support, while others were harsh criticisms. He had seen the article, and it felt like a punch to the gut. The shopkeeper's comment had been wrong, but so had his silence. He hadn't realized it at the time, but now he couldn't escape the truth. His actions, or inaction, had been shaped by assumptions he hadn't even questioned. That evening, another unexpected twist unfolded. The shopkeeper, feeling the pressure of public scrutiny, decided to hold a press conference. Standing in front of his store, he defended his actions, claiming he had only been trying to protect his business. But when pressed about his comment in the bodycam footage, he faltered. "I didn't mean it like that," he stammered. Look, I've had trouble before, okay? I wasn't trying to single anyone out." The apology fell flat, and the crowd outside his store grew restless. Someone shouted, "You're part of the problem." The tension escalated, and the shopkeeper hurried back inside, leaving more questions than answers. As the community's frustration grew, Chief Williams called an emergency meeting with her leadership team. "This is bigger than just one incident now," she said. "We need to be honest about where we've fallen short, and we need to act now." The team discussed potential actions, from increased community outreach to an independent review of department policies. But every suggestion felt like it wasn't enough, not fast enough, not meaningful enough. Meanwhile, Maya continued her investigation. She began reaching out to other officers, current and former, to get a sense of the department's internal culture. What she found was a mix of progress and resistance. Some officers praised Chief Williams for her reforms, while others admitted that old habits and biases still lingered beneath the surface. As the days passed, the tension in the city reached a boiling point. Protests began forming outside the police station, with signs demanding justice and accountability. The voices were loud, but they were also united in their call for change. Connelly watched from a distance, feeling more isolated than ever. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. He began drafting a statement, unsure of whether anyone would listen but determined to try. At home, Chief Williams sat with her daughter, who had grown quieter since the forum. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think so," her daughter replied softly. "But Mom, do you think things will really change?" Chief Williams didn't have an answer, but she held her daughter close. hoping that somehow this storm would lead to something better. The city was on the edge of something monumental, but no one knew which way it would tip. The lines had been drawn, the stakes were higher than ever, and the resolution was still just out of reach. The next steps would define not just the fate of those involved, but the future of a community desperate for healing and justice. Let me know if you'd like to continue from here or adjust any part of the narrative. The protests outside the station grew larger with each passing day, the crowd swelling into a chorus of voices demanding change. Signs waved in the air, bearing messages of justice, reform, and accountability. The pressure was palpable, and it was clear that the department couldn't ignore the call any longer. Chief Williams knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. On a brisk morning, she stood in front of a hastily arranged podium outside the station. Cameras from every major news outlet were trained on her, and the crowd, both supportive and skeptical, waited in tense silence. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium as if bracing herself. "I stand before you today as a mother, a police chief, and a member of this community," she began. "I spent my career fighting to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people we serve, but this past week has shown me how much further we have to go." She acknowledged the mistakes made during her daughter's arrest and the systemic issues that had been exposed. She announced immediate changes: the firing of officers found complicit in discriminatory practices, an external audit of the department, and mandatory anti-bias training for all personnel. The crowd listened intently, though the tension in the air remained. As she wrapped up, a familiar voice broke through the murmurs of the crowd. It was Connolly, stepping forward from the edge of the gathering. He looked visibly nervous but resolute as he approached the microphone. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice carrying through the space. Chief Williams stepped back, her expression unreadable. Connolly turned to face the crowd. "I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to own up to what I did. I arrested that young girl because I didn't take the time to question what I was doing. I acted on assumptions, and those assumptions were wrong." His voice cracked, but he continued. I failed her family, and I failed this community." The crowd remained silent, their expressions a mix of anger and curiosity. "I'm stepping down from the force," he announced. "But before I go, I want to commit to being part of the change. I'll work with this community to ensure no one else goes through what that family went through because of someone like me." For a moment, the crowd didn't react. Then, a single voice shouted, "Actions speak louder than words." Connolly nodded, as if agreeing with the sentiment. Just as the tension seemed to settle, another voice from the crowd cut through the air. It was the shopkeeper, standing on the outskirts with a handful of reporters. "If we're talking about accountability," he shouted, "then let's talk about why this happened in the first place." The crowd turned toward him as he stepped forward, a nervous energy surrounding him. He held up his phone, displaying messages he had received after his press conference. "I've been getting threats because of this," he said. "But you know what? Maybe I deserve them. I made that call to the police because I've been targeted before. My store's been robbed more times than I can count, and every time, no one listens. So I thought, if I said the right words, maybe this time someone would care." The crowd murmured, some expressing sympathy, others frustration. Chief Williams stepped forward again. "What you said was wrong," she told him. "But your frustration isn't unique. We failed as a system to protect everyone in this community, and that failure has pitted us against each other." Suddenly, a young woman in the crowd stepped forward. She was clutching a small, hand-painted sign that read, "Justice for All." "Maybe we're all part of the problem," she said, her voice trembling. "But that means we can all be part of the solution too. Blaming each other isn't going to fix this. Working together will." The atmosphere shifted. Conversations rippled through the crowd, the anger giving way to a mix of reflection and determination. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a moment, an opening for something new. The day ended without a clear victory, but it was clear that things were moving in a different direction. Chief Williams returned home that night, exhausted but hopeful. Her daughter greeted her at the door with a cautious smile. "Did it go okay?" she asked. "It's a start," Chief Williams replied, "but there's a lot of work to do." A few weeks later, the department held its first community-led workshop on policing reform. Connolly was there, sitting in the back, taking notes. The shopkeeper also attended, his nervousness replaced with a quiet determination. And at the front of the room, Chief Williams stood beside her daughter, who had insisted on being part of the change. As the session began, the energy in the room felt different, charged not with anger, but with hope. The story wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the ending could be written together. And just as things seemed to settle, a breaking news alert flashed on Maya's phone. Another incident in a neighboring town, eerily similar to the one that had sparked everything. She sighed, realizing the fight for justice and accountability was far from over. The road ahead would be long, but for this community, at least, the first steps had been taken. As weeks passed, the changes in the community began to feel more real. The department's new reforms were beginning to take root, but the journey toward true healing was far from over. The workshops continued, now with even more involvement from local residents. People who had once been skeptical of the police department's willingness to change were beginning to see a shift. Connolly, though no longer an officer, had become a pivotal part of these workshops. His presence, initially seen as a reminder of past mistakes, was now a symbol of accountability. He was one of the first to admit the flaws within the system, and his willingness to speak up had opened the door for others to do the same. His humility became an asset in the room as he worked alongside community leaders to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and those they served. At the same time, Chief Williams dedicated herself to her daughter's well-being. The scars from that fateful day were still present, though less visible. Maya had returned to school, and while she was slowly adjusting to the new attention, it was clear that her mother's determination to protect her also extended to ensuring that no other child would face the same injustice. As a mother and a police chief, Chief Williams was a woman caught between two worlds, one that demanded accountability and another that needed compassion. While Maya had her own quiet moments of reflection, she had also grown into a new role within the community. She became involved in the youth programs that were set up as part of the police department's new initiatives, focusing on giving children and teenagers the support they needed to thrive, without fear of being judged or discriminated against. Her story, though painful, had sparked something larger, a movement that would continue to grow long after the headlines had faded. It wasn't always easy. There were days when tensions flared again, particularly during moments when people remembered how far they still had to go. But there was also something that had been broken open, a willingness to confront difficult truths and the shared hope that change was possible. Conversations, once silenced by fear, now filled the streets and the town hall meetings, conversations about policing, race, and the power of community. The shopkeeper, who had once fueled the fire with his snap judgment and misinformed call to the police, became a different man. His understanding of bias and discrimination deepened through the many conversations he had with people in the community. He started showing up at the workshops, his demeanor less defensive and more open. The weight of his words from that day lingered, but instead of hiding from it, he chose to face it, even if it meant acknowledging his own role in perpetuating the cycle of misunderstanding. Through it all, the community learned a powerful lesson: that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongs, but about acknowledging the complexities and mistakes that led to them. Accountability was a tool for growth, not a weapon to be used against each other. There were no easy answers, but the conversations were no longer one-sided, and the silence that had once defined their interactions was starting to fade. One afternoon, as Chief Williams walked through the local park with her daughter, she paused to take in the sight of the community: families laughing, children playing, and neighbors chatting under the shade of the old oak tree. It wasn't perfect, but there was a sense of healing in the air, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Mom," Maya said, breaking the quiet, "do you think it's really going to change? Will people remember what happened to me?" Chief Williams smiled softly, kneeling to look her daughter in the eye. I think people will remember. Not just what happened to you, but what happened after. What we chose to do with that pain. It might take time, but change doesn't happen overnight. But if we keep working at it, if we keep showing up, it will happen. As they continued their walk, Chief Williams realized that the true transformation wouldn't come from laws or policies alone. It would come from the people, the ones who had faced injustice and the ones who had learned to confront their own biases. Change would come from the relationships being built in the very spaces where trust had once been broken. But the story didn't end there. As the days went by, Maya received a letter, one that she had never expected. It was from the very officer who had been involved in her arrest. The letter was short but heartfelt. He acknowledged the harm he had caused and expressed his regret for his actions. He wrote that he had been transferred to a different department, but wanted her to know that he had spent every day since their encounter reflecting on his decisions and the systemic issues within law enforcement. The letter was a final piece of closure, a reminder that the road to redemption was long, but possible. Maya felt a mix of emotions, but most of all, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about forgiving and forgetting, but about understanding and moving forward. The entire community, in its own way, had undergone a transformation. The issues that had sparked the events surrounding her arrest had not been resolved overnight, but a process had begun. It was a process that demanded uncomfortable truths and hard conversations, but it was a process that was also filled with hope. As Chief Williams watched her daughter walk ahead of her, the sun setting in the distance, she couldn't help but think about how far they had come. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined them. What had begun with a single moment of injustice had sparked something much larger, a movement of accountability, change, and unity. And though the road was far from over, Chief Williams knew that their story was far from finished. It would continue to unfold, one conversation at a time, one small step toward healing. It was a journey that would shape the future, not just of the police department, but of the entire community. The ending wasn't clear-cut, and there were still challenges to face. But one thing was certain, they were no longer walking down the same path. They had chosen to walk together, and that, in itself, was the beginning of a new chapter. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, the future seemed full of possibility.